The night Zayan was born, the rain did not stop. It fell hard and heavy on the roof of the small hospital on the edge of Lahore, as if the sky itself was nervous. Inside, the hallways smelled of disinfectant and old paint. A single tube light flickered above the door of the delivery room, and when the nurse stepped out with a face that carried no smile, Zayan's father, Tariq, already knew that something was wrong. The baby was too small, too quiet, too early. He weighed just over 1 kilogram. His chest moved up and down so slowly that the doctor watched it for a full minute before saying anything. His skin was thin, almost see-through, like paper held up to a lamp. The doctor placed a gentle hand on Tariq's shoulder and spoke in a low voice. "Prepare yourself," he said. "The chances are not in his favor." Tariq sat down on the bench outside and covered his face with both hands. But inside the room, Zayan's mother, Zarina, did not cry. She was exhausted, and her body was still trembling, but her eyes were fixed on the small glass incubator where her son had been placed. She could see him from her bed, his tiny fingers, his closed eyes, his chest, rising, falling, rising, falling. She reached out toward him, even though he was too far to touch. "You are going to be fine," she whispered. "I know you are." She said it with a certainty that made no logical sense. The doctors had given her numbers, bad numbers. But Zarina had felt something in that room the moment her son took his first breath. Something she could not explain, and did not try to. She simply held on to it, the way you hold on to a candle in a dark hallway. Zayan survived the night, then the week, then the month, and slowly, carefully, like a plant pushing through cracked stone, he came home. Growing up in their small house in a crowded neighborhood near the edge of the city was not easy for Zayan. The streets were loud, the school was underfunded, and Zayan, even as he grew older, remained noticeably smaller than the other boys his age. His legs gave him trouble, a result of the nerve damage from his early birth, and he walked with a slight uneven step that other children noticed immediately. Children can be unkind about things they do not understand. He was given nicknames he did not deserve. He was left out of games he wanted to join. In class, teachers looked past him when hands were raised, assuming the quiet boy in the corner had nothing important to say. At one point, a school doctor reviewed his file and gently advised his parents to set realistic expectations for Zayan's future. Tariq heard this and went quiet in the car all the way home. He loved his son, but love and hope are different things, and Tariq was a man who had been worn down by hard years. He found it difficult to look at Zayan without feeling the weight of worry pressing down on his chest. But Zarina watched her son differently. She noticed things. She noticed how Zayan read, not the way children read for school, quickly, reluctantly, one eye on the clock. He read the way someone drinks water after a long thirst. He would sit on the floor beside the kitchen window for hours, book in his lap, completely still, so absorbed in the words that he would not hear his name being called for dinner. She noticed how he remembered things, dates, names, patterns, stories. He did not just memorize, he understood. He would ask questions that surprised adults. Not rude questions, thoughtful ones, the kind that made people pause and think before answering. And she noticed the way he sometimes stood at the window at night, staring out at the sky with an expression that did not match his age. It was not the look of a child daydreaming. It was something older, something that seemed to be searching for something it had lost a long time ago. Zarina said nothing about this to anyone. She simply watched, and she waited. When Zayan was 13 years old, the episodes began. The first one happened during dinner. He went very still. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes became distant, not closed, but far away, looking at something no one else in the room could see. His breathing slowed down into a deep, steady rhythm, almost like someone meditating. It lasted about 40 seconds. Then he blinked, set his fork down quietly, and said, "Sorry, I don't know what happened." They took him to a doctor, then a specialist, then a neurologist who ran several tests and came back with a careful, honest answer. It was not a seizure. The brain activity was unusual, but not dangerous. The neurologist had no clear name for what it was, And that, in its own way, was more unsettling than any diagnosis. The episodes continued, once or twice a month. Always the same, that deep stillness, that faraway look. And when Zayan came back from them, he sometimes said things that stopped his mother cold. He described a mountain, very tall, very cold, with stone steps that led to a wide hall. He described a large chair, not a throne in a fairy tale sense, but something old and heavy, made of dark stone, sitting at the head of a long room. He described the feeling of wearing something heavy on his head, and the sound of many voices going quiet when he entered a space. He described these things simply, not as dreams, more like memories of a place he had once known very well. Zarina made a quiet decision. She did not go back to the hospital. Instead, she went to see an old scholar who lived 3 streets away, a man named Ustad Ghalib, who was known in the neighborhood for his deep knowledge and his calm manner. He was not a mystic or a fortune-teller. He was simply a learned man who had read more than most and who listened more than he spoke. She brought Zayan to him 3 times. Each time, Ustad Ghalib asked the boy to describe what he experienced during the episodes. He asked no leading questions. He just listened, with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes steady. At the end of the 3rd visit, he poured himself a cup of tea, took 1 slow sip, and then set the cup down. "This boy is not ill," he said. "Something has been placed inside him, something very old and very heavy. It was placed there because he was the one person no one would think to look at." He paused. "No one guards an empty room, and no one expected this child to live." Zarina did not fully understand every word of what Ustad Ghalib said, but she felt the truth of it somewhere deep in her chest, the same way she had felt something in the delivery room 13 years ago. She drove home in silence. Zayan sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window at the passing streets. "Are you scared?" she asked him. He thought about it for a moment. "No," he said. "I think I've been scared before. Whatever this is, I don't think it's here to hurt me." The knowledge did not make Zayan's life easier. If anything, it made it heavier. He was 16, and he was still small, still uneven in his walk, still overlooked in every room he entered. But now he carried the awareness of something living inside him, something vast and ancient that he was nowhere near ready to understand. It sat behind his ribs like a stone that was too large to swallow and too important to put down. He made a quiet decision of his own. If he could not yet understand what was inside him, he would work on building himself worthy of it. He began waking up before the sun, not because anyone told him to, not because it was easy, it was not. He would sit on his prayer mat in the cold dark of early morning and find a silence inside himself that the daytime never offered. He began reading the Quran with intention, not just repetition, and his memorization moved so quickly that the imam at the local mosque asked Zarina if the boy had studied at a special institution. He had not. He had only decided to be serious. He studied on his own in the evenings, history, law, leadership, the stories of people who had built something meaningful from very little. He stopped spending energy on the opinions of people who had already decided he was not worth their attention. He stopped explaining himself. He simply worked. And something began to change. The tremor in his legs, which had been with him since birth, began to fade. Slowly, quietly, without drama. The doctors had no explanation. Zayan had no explanation either. But by the time he was 17, he was walking steadily for the first time in his life. He stood up straight. He filled a doorway differently than he used to. His father noticed. He said nothing about it directly. Tariq was not a man who found words easily. But one evening he came and sat beside Zayan, while the boy was reading, and he stayed there for an hour without saying anything at all. That, for Tariq, was its own kind of apology. Zayan accepted it without making it complicated. At 18, Zayan entered a national youth leadership competition almost without thinking about it. A teacher had left the application form on his desk, not as encouragement, just as information. Zayan filled it out that evening and forgot about it. He submitted a written paper on how to reduce conflict in communities where resources were limited. He wrote it in plain language, no complicated words, no performance. Just ideas that came from watching his own neighborhood for 18 years. He did not expect to win. He won. The award ceremony was held in a large hall in the city. Zayan stood at the podium, in a clean white shirt that his mother had pressed carefully that morning. He spoke for 4 minutes. He thanked no one famous. He made no grand promises. He simply talked about what he had seen, and what he believed could be different, and why ordinary people were more capable than the systems around them usually allowed. When he finished, the room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then it filled with sound. 3 journalists wrote about his speech, not because it was the most polished speech they had ever heard, but because of something harder to name, a quality in his voice, a stillness in the way he stood, that made people in the audience feel they were watching someone step into something that had always been waiting for them. In the back of the hall, Tariq stood up last, but he stood. 4 years later, when Zayan was 22, 3 villages near Lahore were hit by severe flooding after days of relentless rain. Roads were blocked, phone signals cut in and out. Official aid could not reach the affected areas fast enough. Families were stranded on rooftops. Elderly people were trapped inside homes, filling with water. Children were crying in the arms of parents who did not know what to do next. Zayan was not an official. He had no government title, no large organization behind him, no formal authority of any kind. He borrowed a truck, called 2 friends, loaded whatever supplies he could gather on short notice, and drove toward the water. What happened over the next 3 days was documented by a photojournalist who had been stranded nearby, and who, by chance, had her camera with her. From the moment Zayan arrived, something shifted in the chaos. He did not shout. He did not panic. He moved through the wreckage with a quietness that was somehow louder than noise, and people, without being told to, began to follow him. He organized the volunteers who had gathered without direction. He assigned tasks clearly and without hesitation. He identified which areas needed attention first, not based on which cries were loudest, but based on a reading of the situation that was faster and more accurate than anyone around him expected. He carried people on his back through water that came up to his waist. He sat with a frightened elderly woman for 10 minutes before she trusted him enough to let him help her. He negotiated through a broken phone signal with a local official who was refusing to open a blocked access road, speaking not with anger, but with a calm, firm clarity that made argument feel pointless. He did not sleep for 60 hours. When the government response teams finally arrived on the 3rd day, the lead coordinator stepped out of his vehicle and looked around at the organized operation already in progress. The supplies being distributed, the rescued families being sheltered, the clear communication lines, the lists of who had been found and who was still missing. He turned to the nearest person and asked who was in charge of the civilian response. Every hand pointed to the same direction. To the young man with the steady eyes and the uneven walk, who was at that moment carrying a child on his shoulder and speaking quietly to a frightened father. Zayan did not become famous after that. He did not want to. He returned to Lahore, took a position with a small community organization that most people had never heard of, and continued doing the unglamorous, invisible work of making things better in places that the rest of the world had largely stopped looking at. But the neighborhood remembered. The school that had once overlooked him hung his photograph in the corridor near the front entrance, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The teacher who had once looked past his raised hand retired that year and sent a short note to Zarina, saying that she had thought about Zayan often over the years and that she was glad she had been wrong about him. Ustad Ghalib, now very old and rarely leaving his house, heard the news of what had happened at the flood. He sat quietly for a long time. Then he said, to no one in particular, "The seal does not break all at once. It opens slowly, when the person is ready." And Zarina, sitting alone one evening in the kitchen after the house had gone quiet, opened the tin box she kept on the top shelf, the one that held small things she could not throw away. Inside was Zayan's hospital bracelet from the incubator, the one they had put on his tiny wrist the night he was born, the night the doctor had said the chances were not in his favor. She held it between her fingers for a moment. It was smaller than her thumb. She smiled at it, placed it back, and closed the lid. She had known, from the very first night, that the numbers had never told the whole story. They had measured his weight, his lung capacity, his heart rate. They had calculated probability and outcome and risk, but they had not measured what was inside him. No instrument in that hospital could have measured that. Zayan had not survived despite the odds. He had survived because the odds had never understood what they were actually dealing with. The thing sealed inside him, that ancient, heavy, quiet authority, had not been placed there to make his life easy. It had been placed there precisely because his life would be hard, because he would be overlooked, because the world would underestimate him at every turn. And because, in the end, the most powerful thing you can give to someone who must carry something enormous is the experience of knowing exactly how it feels to have nothing at all. He had felt that. He had carried it. And then, quietly, without asking for anyone's permission, he rose.